Welcome back, everyone, to the front line with Joe and Joe. Joe Pasillo, as always, joined by Joe Resinello. And once more, dear brothers and sisters, let us go into the breach on the Veritas Catholic Radio Network, 1350 on your AM dial, 103.9 on your FM dial, spreading the truth of the Catholic faith to the New York City metropolitan area. Please be sure to download the app, the Veritas app. Share it with your friends. You'll have access to all of our station's content, not just the front line with Joe and Joe. And if you like what we do, we go live on social media. Thursday nights, 9 o'clock Eastern Time, X Rumble, Facebook, YouTube. You know that's where Joe and I get into a whole lot of trouble, and we don't mind because, as we say, we're going into the breach with every show. So if you like what you see, help us out. Like, subscribe, share. We don't ask you for money or any of that stuff. We just ask you to hit a click and help us out and help us to reach a wider audience. So today, Joe and I, we love all the topics that we talk about. Today, we're going to talk about business. Okay. And let's face it, we are Americans. In America, as always has been, business is a very important thing. Corporate America, what we produce, how our economy looks, how it functions, and how to be successful within our economic system. So today, we're very pleased and honored to be joined by Dr. Andrew Abela, and we're going to be discussing his new book, Super Habits, the Universal System for a Successful Life. Now, that'll be available. It is available at Sophia Institute Press. Joe and I will post a link in the description. If you click the link to buy the book, you'll get a 15% discount because you know Joe and Joe, and that's always a beautiful thing. With that, I want to just introduce Dr. Abela. He is the founding dean of the Bush School of Business at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. His award-winning, widely cited research on integrity, we're going to talk about that a lot, integrity and effectiveness in business has been published in several academic journals and in 3 books. He speaks to business leaders around the world about cultivating the super habits of success personally and in their organizations. Prior to his academic career, Dr. Abela was a brand manager at Procter & Gamble, management consultant with McKinsey & Company, and managing director at the Corporate Executive Board. Dr. Andrew Abela, welcome to the front line with Joe and Joe, our brother.
A pleasure to be here. Thank you.
You're welcome. And this is going to be a great conversation, as I said. Joe Resinello, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Doctor, we always begin our conversation with a prayer to Our Lady in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. Remember, O most gracious Virgin Mary, never was it known that anyone who sought your help or sought your intercession was left unaided. Inspired by this confidence, we fly unto you, a virgin of virgins, our mother. To you we come, for you we stand, sinful and sorrowful. O Mother of the Word incarnate, despise not our petitions, but in your clemency hear and answer us. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, Doc, as Joe Pasillo said, this is an important conversation because as Catholics, we're supposed to be in the world, but we're not of the world, which means we have to work in business. Joe Pasillo was a broker, full disclosure. He works in corporate America, and so do I. I work on Wall Street currently as well. We do this out of the goodness of our heart. We don't get paid to do this.
Not yet.
Yes. So we have to work to put food on the table for our families. And, I've been working on Wall Street for over 25 years. I know the deal. Joe Pasillo was a broker. He knows the deal. And you teach at a business school. Why do I say all that? Because there are common traits amongst successful people. And as Catholics, if we're good Catholics, that will bleed into good habits in life. It simply will. Talk about how we as Catholics are the summation of our habits and how those habits bleed into our lives in the secular world.
Absolutely. I would say I teach at a business school. I'm the dean of a business school, and not just any business school. It's the Bush School of Business at the Catholic University of America, which, as many of your listeners will probably know, is the only college or university in the United States owned directly by the Catholic Church. So the Bush School of Business is, in a sense, the business school of the Catholic Church. So what you're talking about is exactly what we go to sleep and wake up every day thinking about, is how does one live as a faithful Catholic in the business world. So our habits that kind of form our lives are at the heart of everything we do. If you are a respectful person, it's unlikely that you will be respectful at work and not at home, and the habits in particular we talk about are those that your listeners will know as the virtues, right? Which is the traditional term for virtue. And the problem with the word virtue is a lot of people misunderstand it. They think of it as just a good character, a good characteristic. But each of the virtues is a habit. So, for example, self-discipline is a habit that we used to call temperance. But the word temperance is misunderstood by people, but it's basically self-discipline. If you are a self-disciplined person, chances are you're self-disciplined at home and you're self-disciplined at work. I like to call the collection of virtues or the collection of habits or super habits, as I call them, as the human operating system, because they underlie everything that we do. And if you don't update the operating system on your phone or your laptop, things start to go funny, right? Apps stop working, you're more easily hacked. It's the same with our human lives. If you don't keep that human operating system in tune, if you're not self-disciplined, if you don't have the habit of justice, if you don't have the habit of wisdom, then everything else you do is going to be not as effective by far.
Absolutely. Dr. Andrew Abela is joining us here at the front line with Joe and Joe. The book available at Sophia Press, Super Habits, the Universal System for a Successful Life. Let me stay there for a second, Dr. Abela. I mean, Joe and I say on the show, we're very plain speaking guys. I think you probably have gotten that up to this point. Okay. I want to throw at you one of the problems I see. Okay. And I think it speaks to what you just said is I always call it at the show. I think one of the problems with corporate America is the Michael Corleone attitude from The Godfather. It's you could excuse anything because it's only business. It's not personal. And I remember even when I wasn't so practicing a Catholic, let's say, when I was away from the church for a number of years, that never did sit right with me. When I was a stockbroker in another life, that never sat right with me. No, what you do to somebody, all right, or what you don't do for somebody in business, no, that does say something about you as a person. You can't just excuse that. They're saying, well, it's only business, and in business, or like in business, well, we don't have to worry about those ethical or moral and considerations. I think you know where I'm going, Dr. Abela. Tell me if you agree. Tell me if I'm wrong. I'd love for you to a few comments on that.
Sure. So I agree, but I'm going to make a small qualification. So I agree in that business is a human endeavor. So all of the rules of human endeavor, all of what it makes to be a flourishing, successful human being, apply in business as they apply elsewhere. If you lie to people and you cheat and so on, and you excuse that by saying it's just business, you're not actually going to be very successful in business. That it is partly a Hollywood problem, because Hollywood, somebody some years ago did a study, and they found that when there's a CEO role in a Hollywood movie, there's an 80% chance that the CEO is a crook. That's it, right. When in reality, fewer than 1% of CEOs are ever convicted for any kind of criminal activity, or found to be dishonest or whatever. So there's that Hollywood perception that people have. In general, I think most people in business realize that if you're not being a decent human being, you're probably not going to get very far for very long. I will say, though, that Michael Corleone has there's some truth to his point, which is sometimes you have to be able to do difficult things in business that may be uncomfortable and then be able to sleep at night. So, for example, I've had to fire people over my career, and obviously you want to do that with justice, but sometimes the just thing to do is to remove somebody if they're not up to the job. You're doing their colleagues a favor, because the colleagues feel like, well, why am I working so hard to cover this other person's failings? And then that other person too is sometimes the best thing for them is to be moved on, and maybe they find a place where they can fit in better, or maybe it's a wake-up call to say, if I don't get my butt in gear, things aren't going to work. So there's an element of that where there's a sort of harshness that can arise in business. But in some ways, it's not that different from the harshness of being a good parent, a good father or good mother. Just wanting your kids to be happy all the time and therefore not disciplining them is the cruelest thing you can do to your kids, right? It's just a really bad way to raise them. So it's not that different, I guess, in that sense. But just generally speaking, if you take the long-term view, living a decent life in business is going to be generally more successful. And of course, if you take the very long-term view, which includes the afterlife, then yes, that's always the better path, you know. So we should never forget that, you know, because you can't justify everything just by what happens before we die. Because if you did, then kind of who gets the most toys before he dies wins is a good strategy, you know. But knowing that there's something that comes after that changes the calculus somewhat. But even just in this worldly terms, generally speaking, when I talk, I as dean of a business school, I spend a lot of time with successful CEOs, and generally speaking, they are good people, you know.
Yeah. It's funny you said that about I remember back in the day when I was a stockbroker, if I had a nickel for every time somebody said, "Hey, he who dies with the most toys wins," I would have never had to be a stockbroker because I would have been rich. Dr. Andrew Abela is joining us here at the front line with Joe and Joe. Please go out and buy his book, Super Habits: The Universal System for a Successful Life. That's available at Sophia Press. Doctor, thank you for those comments on that. Joe Resinello, where do you want to go?
Obviously, the title of the book, Doc, is Super Habits. Is this an ancient idea? Because some people may say it is. People nowadays, you hear about the different. I can't even keep up with it. Gen X, Gen Z. I don't even know what it is, but they throw these terms around all these kids. Do they look to practice virtue? I know in business school, I went to business school. I didn't go to a fancy one. I went to St. Peter's College in Jersey City, but I do have an MBA, and you have to take business ethics. Is it just, lip service, business ethics, acquiring these super habits? Talk about that. Is it something ancient, or is it still in practice?
Yeah, you have two really, really good questions about, is it ancient and is it just sort of window dressing? It's definitely ancient. I mean, the idea of virtue is thousands of years old. It comes to us from the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans. You can see it in all of the major religions, whether it's Hinduism or Islam or Judaism, especially Christianity. The idea of virtue is something very deeply human. But we lost that some time ago, and people stopped talking about virtue. And instead of started talking about ethics as sort of compliance, as just rules that you add on. So you have business, and business is business, the sort of Corleone approach, as you said. And then you have ethics, and the ethics is a check on the business. So you should make as much money as you can, but don't cross these lines, And the problem is the lines keep shifting, it seems like, and there's always pressure to cross the lines. And so you have this apparent tension between those who are making the money and those who are supposed to stop them crossing the lines. And it's not a very healthy, productive tension. But the idea of virtue is it doesn't draw this distinction between making the money and being good. It focuses instead on excellence in every dimension. So if you're an excellent manager, you are excellent at making money for the company, you are excellent at treating your people well, and you are excellent at being moral. So it's kind of moral excellence is part of that whole package. And you can see that if we go through each of the cardinal virtues, the four big ones, right? So classically, we know them as prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. But as I mentioned before, a lot of these words lose their meaning. So prudence, when you hear the word prudence, you think of somebody who's kind of prissy and overly cautious, right? No. Prudence, otherwise called practical wisdom, is the habit of making wise decisions. So a really good risk taker would be, by that definition, prudent, right? That's part of practical wisdom. Justice, the habit of treating others fairly. Fortitude or courage, the habit of not letting your fears get in the way of what you need to do. So it's not the question of not having fear, that no one can control that. Sometimes fears or anxieties arise. The courageous person, the person with a habit of courage, is the one who says, yeah, I may be afraid, I may be anxious, I'm just going to do it anyway, And then temperance, as I mentioned before, is the habit of self-discipline, which is the most misunderstood of all. The habit of self-discipline is not the habit of grit your teeth and kind of suck it in and move forward. It's the habit of cultivating your desires so that they move you in the right direction. So that the habit of self-discipline is the habit of only saying yes to a desire when it makes sense. And when it doesn't make sense, trying to, through practice, change it so that you start to desire the things that you should be desiring instead of things that are going to get in the way or kind of mess you up. So it's a much more integrated way of understanding success that integrates effectiveness and ethics together. But when we lost that, that's when we got the nonsense kind of approach to business ethics that, Joe, you're talking about, where it's kind of just little icing that you dust on business to make it look kind of ethical.
Doesn't it, Dr. Abela, doesn't it require, though, that we have an objective view, like we're supposed to as Catholics in particular? I mean, and like you said, any major world religion has an objective view of what the right and the wrong are, what the moral and the immoral are, what the unethical and the ethical is. Doesn't it require that firmness of objectivity of what is right and what is wrong? Like you said, these ideas, they shift. Joe and I are of the opinion, because we've discussed this many times on a more general level, the problem of moral relativism is those lines can shift just willy-nilly, where I think, if I'm reading you correctly, but there still has to be objective standards of the right thing to do and the wrong thing to do. What do you think?
Yes, but funnily enough, ironically enough, that's the lesser problem. Because in the main, most people agree that you shouldn't lie and you shouldn't steal and you shouldn't kill, right? Most people agree with that. The problem, you get two kinds of problems. One is where kind of at the edges where people disagree. So everyone agrees you shouldn't kill, but then we fight over capital punishment, we fight over abortion, right? So there are times when we know that it's legitimate to kill, other times when we know we shouldn't. So there are those kind of, there are specific issues where there are big disagreements, and those are important. But the bigger problem is it's not just the knowing, it's being in the habit of doing, right? So we know we're not supposed to lie or cheat, but then a temptation comes and no one's looking, and so we cheat, you know? And so it's the difference between values and virtues. Values is kind of knowing what to do, and it's talking the talk. Virtues is being in the habit of doing it. It's walking the walk. Because when someone goes to jail for white-collar crime, it's usually not because they didn't know that what they were doing was wrong. They knew it, but they did it anyway, you see? So yes, you have to have those moral absolutes laid out. But what I'm saying is most of the time, it's especially in business, it's not an issue with a disagreement on moral absolutes. It's just an unwillingness or an inability to live through the absolutes that you already believe in. You see what
Absolutely.
I mean?
Joe, if you don't mind, I want to stay there a second. You're in education. Dr. Andrew Abela is joining us here at the front line with Joe and Joe. Please go out and buy his book, Super Habits, the Universal System for a Successful Life. You're in education, of course. Where do you think the American education system is at as far as inculcating these ancient practices, the development of virtues? Let's just say, even taking it out of the Catholic context, even just keeping it with Aristotle or Cicero, okay? Pagans who wrote about virtue and what it means to be a virtuous person and everything else. Are we teaching this, let's say, in general? I'm not talking about, let's say, I know you are at your school, but are we teaching this in general in higher education in America?
With a few small exceptions. So at the K-12 level, there's some charter schools, some classical curriculum schools, some Catholic schools, some Christian schools, other Christian schools that teach virtue. There are. I've been to them, and they're exciting. It's exciting to see this, and it's very rewarding. At the college level, almost nobody, because here's the thing. So the vast majority don't even talk about it. But those that do talk about it, it's not enough to just talk about it. Like, you have to give students opportunities to practice. So here's some good news. Just this summer, Catholic University, we received $1 million grant from a foundation to kind of drive this forward, to not just be teaching, because we've been experimenting with this in the business school and a few other places throughout campus. So this is so that across the entire campus of Catholic University, every student, as part of different classes, will get opportunities to practice the different virtues as part of doing their homework, as part of being in class. because without that practice, as I say, it doesn't go from here to here.
Absolutely. I'm going to throw it over to Joe, but I will tell this: we were talking about leadership and virtues with Joe McInerney recently from the Knights of Columbus, and he has a great series. And I brought it up to him. I'm bringing it up to you, but just as a comment, it's amazing when you mention charter schools. My wife is now a first grade teacher. She's a first grade teacher here at a charter school in Arizona. It's not a Catholic school, it's a charter school. Okay. Their mission in their 22 school system is the development of virtue. Now, of course, they're
Fantastic.
teaching the classes. And one of the things that my wife asked me to do with her that was required of her, Dr. Abela, listen to this. As a first grade teacher, my wife needed to read Cicero's treatise on friendship, okay, which is all about virtue. Okay. And to me, that is a very hopeful sign. That means that you're not don't just have to rely on the Catholic schools, that there are good charter schools out there also that are doing this important work that you're doing there. If you're just joining us here at the front line with Joe and Joe, Super Habits, the Universal System for a Successful Life. The book is written by Dr. Andrew Abela, who's gracious enough to join us here at the front line with Joe and Joe. Please buy it from the publisher, Sophia Press. Go ahead, Dr. Abela.
Yeah, I would say one thing to that. That is very encouraging news. And I would make a suggestion to them that maybe you can pass back through your wife is read it by all means, fantastic. And then on a regular basis, among the teachers, talk about how are we practicing the virtue of friendship. So don't just read it, but live it and kind of challenge each other and give each other feedback on, are we living the virtue of friendship? Because that's the last mile that people have to travel down. Is we read it, we know it, and then we just have to do it. Because as we do it repeatedly, it then becomes part of us. And that's the beauty of these virtues, which is why I call them super habits, is you practice them and they become part of you. So any human being can become friendlier, more courageous, wiser, etc. by practice.
Absolutely. Joe Resinello.
Doc, I want to dissect something you said earlier, the difference between value and virtue. And also, like you mentioned, like you have, say, a rule and no one's looking, and then you compromise the rule due to some pressure. Because we're human and people, are flawed. I'm on the front of that line. But what I want to kind of get into there is how grace works in this process, because I think this is important. You come from McKinsey. A lot of people may not know about that firm. I do. They only hire engineers, people from Ivy League schools. You don't just apply there, and you work with CEOs. When I was at JP Morgan at Morgan Stanley, a McKinsey analyst sits right next to the CEO of Morgan Stanley, and JP Morgan crunches their numbers. They work crazy hours. They're highly ambitious people, and they become CEOs. The ex-CEO of Morgan Stanley, James Gorman, an Australian attorney who had an MBA from Columbia, was a McKinsey partner. Just for people to get some idea of where we're talking about. These are highly motivated people, good habits, driven to no end. With that said, very gifted people, and you've been surrounded by them, you probably your whole entire life, have a lot of hubris. They're very confident. And sometimes that could blind you because we are all human and we all fall. That's where grace comes in. I'm not as gifted. I'm not completely ungifted, but I'm not as gifted, but I'm fully aware of my flaws. And I rely upon grace to live my life as a husband, a father, as well as in the world. Talk about the need for grace, because I don't think you could legislate virtue or value, however you call it. I personally think you have to rely upon God and grace. I go to mass every day, at lunch, at work. People know I do. I do because I need to. That's what drives me to be Catholic. Talk about that in the business world, how that translates, how that grace, that supernatural gift from God helps us. A lot there. I know.
Yeah, it is a lot. It is a lot. It's you can climb to the highest levels of virtue in a purely human sense and still find that you are missing something, right? I think that's kind of where you're going. With the help of grace, it is easier to grow in virtue, and you can climb to much higher heights. So there's a theologian by the name of John of St. Thomas from the late Middle Ages who gives a really beautiful analogy. He said, and just very apt, he says, growing in virtue is like rowing a boat. So as you row, if you're rowing every day, your muscles get stronger, you get better at rowing. That's like practicing any virtue, you get better at it. It gets easier, you go faster. He said, but when grace comes into it, it's like hoisting sails. And the gifts of the Holy Spirit are like sails that help you catch grace. And so the boat is still moving in the same direction, but now it's moving faster and with less effort on your part. And so we experience this at times. So for example, let's say you get this inspiration and you make a really good decision. Someone else might have been practicing the virtue of practical wisdom, make good decisions for years, and maybe you have been practicing that for years, but all of a sudden you're faced with a really difficult problem and you just get this amazing insight, and you realize, okay, that wasn't me. That's went way beyond anything I could have done. That was grace, or same with courage. The courage of the martyrs, right, is the paradigmatic example of, like, everybody's afraid to die, and dying a horrendous death like some of the martyrs die, to be willing and even happy and go to that singing, that's not natural, that's supernatural. That's the power of grace. All of that said, I think it was Etienne Gilson, a great French philosopher from the last century, who said, piety is no substitute for technique. So you cannot. So let's say if you're working on the street or Wall Street as an analyst, you cannot say, you know what, I'm not going to study Excel, and be really good at spreadsheets, but I am going to go to Mass and say a novena, and hopefully God will make up the difference with grace. Like, no. You have to work hard. You have to be really good at what you do, and then grace will lift you further. So you cannot use grace as a substitute, because God is just rewarding you for being a slacker, right? So just to be clear on that, because sometimes I worry that especially among young people, it's like, well, I'm a good person and very faithful, and you should hire me for that. It's like, yeah, but you got to be hardworking. You got to put in the effort and so on, and God will bless that. Yeah.
Yeah. Dr. Andrew Abela. We're going to take a quick break here at the front line with Joe and Joe. Dr. Andrew Abela is here, and we're discussing his new book, Super Habits, the Universal System for a Successful Life, that's available at Sophia Press. So you could buy it, I'm sure, on Amazon. You could buy it at Barnes & Noble. Correct, Doctor? People can buy it just by Googling it. Of course, we would like for you to support not only our Catholic authors like Dr. Abela, but also our Catholic publishers, particularly Sophia Press. So click the link in the description. You can buy the book. You're with the front line with Joe and Joe on the Veritas Catholic Radio Network, 1350 on your AM dial, 103.9 on your FM dial. Stick around. We have another great segment with Dr. Abela. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone, to the front line with Joe and Joe. Joe Pasillo and Joe Resinello. We're way in the breach with Dr. Andrew Abela. We're discussing his new book, Super Habits, the Universal System for a Successful Life. It's available at Sophia Press. You could click the link in the description, and you'll get a discount because you know Joe and Joe. Joe, if you don't mind, I'm going to start this segment, if that's okay. Doctor, I have a question for you, okay? I know, and we all know this. I'm just going to keep it with myself for a second, okay? St. Paul said, I do the things I'm not supposed to do. I don't do the things I'm supposed to do. Who is to help a wretch like me? Of course, when I quote scripture, Doctor, I'm usually butchering it, but it's, I think you know where I'm going. He says, who is to help a wretch like me? Thank God for Jesus Christ. Now, where am I going with this? Okay. He's saying that he doesn't do the things he's supposed to do. All right. He does the things he's not supposed to do. But at the end of the day, when you're developing the habits, the super habits that you're talking about, and you do the things you're supposed to do, okay, I'm going to say from my own personal experience, and again, I have had and still do have some habits that really need to get broken, okay? Having said that, though, I know that when I'm trying, I know that when I step up, by God's grace, but when I make a decision to say, I have to do something about that, whatever that thing might be. Life does become a bit easier. Life is a little bit easier. A quick example, and I'm going to throw it over to you. I haven't worked out since I've been in my 30s. Okay, I got married, and like men who get married, like just stop working out or whatever the case might be. And recently, I have my wife, I have our 15-year-old son, and I want him to start working out. And I've had to made a decision to get back to the gym with my wife and my son. Very difficult after a number of years not being in the gym to develop the habit of physical exercise. But I have to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning to do it because it's the only time of the day the three of us could go to the gym together. I know that I did not want to do that starting a month and a half ago when we started, but I had to get up and do it. And you know what? Right now, 6 weeks later, I can say, Doc, I'm pretty happy. And now the habit has been formed and is moving forward. Again, I know that was a mouthful, but I'm using the idea of working out, but we can apply this to many, many different things. You got to start. And you will be, once you get into the routine and develop the habit, you're going to be happier that you did.
Yeah, in the book, I use the phrase beginning is winning. Because what we know is from the very first step that you make, you already start to experience life getting better. And so the trick is to pick something that you can do, that you know you will do. So I'm impressed that you started with 3 a.m. Someone else may have had to start with 5 a.m., say the first time, if they're used to getting up at 6, because that 3 a.m. is just too much, you know. And the danger is they try 3 a.m. once, twice, and then they give up, you know. So you don't want to aim. In your case, it was exactly the right thing to aim for because clearly it stuck, it's worked, right? But the beauty about habits is what the neuroscientists call neuroplasticity. So the fact that our brain can change. Through practice, through habits, we create new pathways in our brain. And once you have a new pathway, it's easier to go down for your actions and your thoughts to go down that pathway. And so the beauty of the habits, the beauty of virtue is life actually gets easier and you're doing the things that are better for you, you know? So sometimes with our students, they look at the way forward, growing, say, as a Catholic, and they think, "Oh my gosh, that just seems like one long climb," you know. A friend of mine has this line: in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was no." You know, and that's kind of how we see the moral life. It's like I can't do this, I can't do that. It's just such a drag. I just keep struggling along. So, but it's not that way at all. Is that as you take these steps, whether it's whichever virtue. Life does actually get easier. And it's like you're moving in line with the way you should be anyway. Life gets easier. You get happier. In many cases, you get healthier, not just from the habit of working out. The research is really interesting on this. As you grow in gratitude, for example, they've done studies where people grow in gratitude and they experience a reduction in anxiety, a reduction in depression, reduction in chronic pain. So both mental and physical. And so all kinds of wonderful things happen when you grow in any of the virtues. And by the way, working out is part of the virtue of what I call suppleness. It's one of the virtues of self-discipline. So what you're doing in working out is actually growing in self-discipline, growing in virtue. But you probably knew that because it's a virtuous person who gets up at 3 a.m. every day, you know?
I'm trying, Doc. I'm trying.
But it sounds like it's working. It sounds like it's working, you know?
Well, and again, it's because the way I see it, and then I'm going to hand it over to Joe. I mean, it's not something that you haven't heard before. Is like the harder something is, the greater the reward. It's easy to fall into nasty, bad habits. It doesn't really take a lot of effort to do that. Okay. And having been there, and we've all, I guess, at some point in our lives, to one degree or another, have been the prodigal son. It's not hard, okay, to fall into a life that's just not going to lead you down very good paths. So you could convince, I did in my life, you could convince yourself that you're happy all you want because all you live for is short-term pleasure. Okay, rather than joy and happiness, which is not the same as pleasure. Okay, that's easy. Okay, I've done that. I don't know many people who haven't been down that road. But like you said, I'm glad you said it too. I've always said the hardest part, using the gym as an example, the hardest part about getting back to the gym is just that day one.
Yeah.
Day one's the hardest day. It
Yeah.
just, it feeds itself. And I imagine, I'll throw it over to you for a quick comment before we don't throw it over to Joe, is I imagine day one, whether it comes to anything, that's worth doing, and particularly what you're talking about, business or any other venture in life.
Yeah, in fact, if I was saying if somebody was really struggling to go to the gym, get up, go, change, do 5 minutes on the treadmill, shower and come home, just like, and call it a success. And tomorrow go for 6 minutes or 7, just pick the littlest thing that you know you can do and then start doing it. And once it's in the habit, it's like, well, I'm here. I may as well lift some weights. I may as well do this and that, So, but the trick is start easy and just repeat and repeat. And then it just becomes, as I say, becomes habit.
Yeah, I guess that was my larger point is that, it's very easy to have the snowball effect when it comes to sin and bad habits. But we could start the snowball effect on the other side too, developing virtue and the super habits, as you've written about in your book, super habits, the universal system for a successful life. If you're just joining us here at the front line with Joe and Joe, Dr. Andrew Abela, who is the founding dean of the Bush School of Business at the Catholic University of America, has written this book. Buy it from Sophia Press, please. Buy it, number one, wherever you buy it, but hopefully you buy it from Sophia Press and support our Catholic publishers. Joe Resinello.
Doc, you mentioned something about habits that's important. You said repeat. Many years ago, when nuns taught many of us, they would make you do things over and over and over. Why? Because you develop a habit. They knew what they were doing. I want to kind of tie this into Lent because you mentioned, like neurological, like workings of the mind, developing habits over the course of, say, 40 days. There is something to that. Obviously, it ties to the biblical reference that Christ was in the desert for 40 days. But when you have like a period of Lent where, say, you're not doing whatever, a certain thing, or you're developing a certain habit, to do it for 40 days isn't then to just stop it when Lent is done. It's to continue it. And a Catholic who is self-disciplined will be successful in life. If you practice your faith, particularly in Advent and in Lent, and even fasting regularly, you have control of yourself. And we talked about common themes. You worked at McKinsey. Successful people have self-control. I've always heard in business, the second best answer to yes is no. In fact, Warren Buffett has said that. He knows how to say no to the most important person, himself. That doesn't just happen. You don't just flip a switch and have self-discipline. And practicing your faith during periods of Lent, during the Advent period, even on Fridays, you say, I don't do this. If you really want to go biblical, throw Wednesday in there too, if you want to get medieval on people. But these are times where you develop a habit. And when you have control of yourself, that will bleed into life. Your thoughts?
So the virtue of temperance, the virtue of self-discipline or self-control, according to Thomas Aquinas, and so my whole book I'm drawing from Aquinas, his treatise on the virtues, which is magnificent. According to him, there are 15 virtues of self-discipline, basically 15. So self-discipline itself is a huge virtue. It's one of the cardinal virtues, difficult to grow in a big one like that. So he lists these 15, one of which is chastity, another one would be sobriety, just going to go through them all. And they are for 15 different types of desire we have. So if it's sexual desire, it's chastity. If it's desire for drink, it's sobriety, desire for food. We call it abstemiousness, And so, but what we know from contemporary research is exactly to your point, Joe, that growing in any one of those helps you grow in self-discipline overall. So saying no to food through fasting is a way to grow in self-discipline. Going to the gym, saying no to desire to just sleep longer is another way to grow into self-discipline. And the beautiful thing is it's very, very portable. So you can pick any exercise to grow in self-discipline, and that's going to strengthen your overall self-discipline muscle. So, which is really, really powerful. In the book, I tell all kinds of different stories. The book is written like a self-help book with lots of stories. But as you go through this, you see how different people have used different virtues of self-discipline. So restraint is one, of just kind of saying no to instinctive things. Humility is one of the 15. Very interesting. Humility is having a right understanding of who you are. And so it's not giving in to desires to think that you're bigger than you are, or even desires to think that you're smaller or less than you are. Both of those would be violations of humility. But any one of these will help you grow in self-discipline or self-control.
Absolutely. Dr. Andrew Abela is joining us here at the front line with Joe and Joe. Doc, let me ask you this. Let's talk about our culture, okay? And how your book we could get some really nice lessons from your book and what you're writing about, okay? I don't think it's an overly judgmental statement to say that American culture is all into immediacy, immediate gratification. Much of our society, obviously, there's many good parts of our culture, but there's really some bad ones. Okay, and we could just look at, let's say, the entertainment industry, and they promote a lot of this stuff. Okay, um, and it seems like that's just short term. Any just temporal pleasure. It's just short term. You're not looking at the longer view of your life. And so you kind of refrain from you come up with some long term solutions, which I think is what you're talking about when you talk about the development of these super habits. This is a big problem. I think it's a problem with our culture. I think it's a problem with. I don't think we're teaching kids the right way. I think it's a problem with our government and the way the government treats the trust that we give to them, especially when it comes to they don't have much virtue in terms of temperance and prudence when it comes to spending our money. This is not a political conversation, but that's a fact. Okay, they don't seem to practice much of these virtues. How difficult is it going to be to turn? I think America needs to be turned around. I know Joe believes that, and the development of these super habits is essential. It's not an option. It's not just we may or may not check off that box. No, I think this has to be central to how we move forward as a nation.
It has to be, and this is why I wrote the book. This is why we teach this at the Bush School. It is, in some sense, the only way forward. So many of our problems in our society right now trace directly to a lack of virtue, lack of specific virtue. So the big divisions, between left and right, neighbor doesn't talk to neighbor because of who you vote for. The decline in marriage, unwillingness to make a commitment, the lack of productivity growth. You go through them all, they can all be traced to some lack of virtue somewhere. And so we need to fix that. But as you said before, you can't legislate virtue. You cannot make it a law that people have to be self-disciplined. It has to come from inside. And so my approach to this, my training is in marketing. Before McKinsey, I was at Procter and Gamble. I teach, or I don't teach much now because I'm the dean, but when I did teach, I taught a lot of marketing classes. And so in a sense, I see myself as promoting virtue, selling the idea of virtue. And I think the way to sell it to people is, as you grow in virtue, you will be happier, healthier, more effective, and life will be easier. It's like, who doesn't want that? If I sold you a pill that would make your life easier, happier, healthier, wouldn't you get it? Oh, absolutely. So the answer is fairly simple. Find the virtue that you most need and just start practicing it. And so I think we need to encourage this to our young people in schools. We need to encourage this to our employees. I see a big opportunity there as companies start to realize that if your employees are growing in virtue, they will be more productive. Then companies will want to help employees grow in virtue. And it will be good for the employees to do that because they'll be happier, So there's a number of avenues we can do this. We just have to get on it. And writing the book was, for me, the first step. So,
Dr. Abela, Joe, if you don't mind, I just want to ask a quick follow-up. Talk about, okay, I think anybody would agree with what you're saying, or should agree with what you're saying. Development of super habits is going to lead to leading a happier life. But talk about how the super habits, stay there for a second, help us to face the challenges of life, because we're all going to go through pain and suffering. It's inevitable on one level or another. People pass away, mothers, fathers, whatever the case might be. There's tragedy. Talk about how the super habits help us not just to lead a happier life, but deal with the adversity of life.
Very good. So 3 of the habits help you avoid unnecessary adversity. So self-discipline stops us from doing stupid stuff that then is going to create suffering for us later on. I don't have to get into details. People can imagine whatever your favorite temptation is. Practical wisdom helps us make better decisions so that we don't do stupid stuff that will lead to more suffering later on. And then same with justice, helps us be sure we treat others fairly so that they don't try to come after us because we cheated them, you know. The habit for dealing with adversity is the virtue of courage, right? So it's the habit of moving forward, even though you're suffering or afraid, or you know, the beauty of it is as we grow in courage, we feel the pain less. This is amazing. So the contemporary positive psychology shows us this. If I have anxiety, for example, but I move forward anyway, not only does the habit make me more likely to move forward in the face of anxiety, it makes the pain of the anxiety go down. I'll give you a very specific example. You maybe have heard of cognitive behavioral therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy is more coaching people in the super habit of resilience, which is basically one of the four. There are four different virtues associated with courage. So it's basically cognitive behavioral therapy is basically giving you the opportunity to practice courage. That's doing, and which is the habit of moving forward anyway, and it reduces the pain. So antidote to pain and suffering. They don't eliminate suffering, but they reduce it. And
Joe Rossinello.
I want to talk to you, Doc, about an experience that I had when I was at Morgan Stanley. At the time, I was working in internal audit, and we were down in your city, Washington, D.C. My partner at the time was a University of Virginia graduate. He was a CPA, and we were meeting with some of his friends from the University of Virginia. Very good school, very smart people. And I remember the woman sitting in front of me, she says to me, if I was the senior on the audit, they were younger than me. So she's like, if I sell my soul for just a short period of time, I could then get ahead, and I'm going to then basically I'll make it. And she didn't really know I was a religious person. I was just sitting here listening. Why do I tell this story? Short-term fixes versus long-term solutions. A lot of people in business think like that. It's short-term fix. How are we doing this month as opposed to how we're going to do this year or in 5 years or in 10 years. Too many people think on those terms. Sometimes they're above you and you have no control of it. But many people in life think on those terms. And frankly, life is not a sprint. It's a marathon. I mean, I'm a 54-year-old man. There's been many chapters to my life, and I'm still not done. So, I mean, like, I think our culture thinks on those short-term fixes a little bit too much, as opposed to the, what's it called, long-term solutions. Address that, please, because I think that's a very relevant conversation.
yeah, the problem with this idea of sell your soul for a short period of time is everything we do forms a habit. So you can be conscious about it and try to form good habits, form super habits, virtues, or you could be not conscious and just follow instincts and form different kind of habits. It's hard to get out of that. So you might say, well, I'm going to cut corners and so on, but then I'll reach a certain point and then I'll go straight again. It's like that's going to be really hard because you've built yourself into a habit that's pushing against where you need to go. And that's the same thing with short-term thinking, right? The more you practice short-term thinking, the easier it becomes to be a short-term thinker. So we talk to our students, for example, about the temptation to cheat. If you cheat on an exam, you become better at cheating. And every time you cheat, you increase the chance of cheating more the next time. Whereas if you study harder, you become better at studying harder. And every time you study harder, you make it easier to study harder the next time. So you want to make sure that you have a clear vision of where you want to go, and then be building the habits to go to that vision.
Dr. Andrew Abela, let me ask you this, because this is something that obviously Joe and I, we're blue collar guys. We're just working guys. Okay. We've had to work hard in our lives. It doesn't matter. See, we've done away with that notion. Just because you're in corporate America, we're going to call you white collar. We're going to call you blue. No, we have to wake up every day and we have to do a lot. Okay. So I guess my question is this: anybody listening to this conversation, it's going to pop into the head the question of time. time is very important, I think, here, because a lot of times I know I've used as an excuse, I don't have the time to do that, right? I can't carve out the time. How important is it in the development of these super habits that you're writing about to take a look at your day, okay, and prioritize your time? Do the things that are most important, fit them in, do whatever you have to do, but the prioritization of time, how important is that?
So there's one of the 15 virtues of self-discipline is called the virtue of orderliness, which is exactly that, which is the habit of doing the right things at the right time. And part of building that is thinking about your day and thinking about what you want to accomplish for that day and for what you're going to do. But like every other virtue, there are tiny steps you can take. And so, for example, if you feel like you're completely disordered and your life is out of control and you have trouble catching up with things, maybe the smallest thing you start out with is each morning, write down one thing that you need to accomplish that day, just one thing. And then at the end of the day, cross it out if you accomplished it. And then do the same thing the next day and the next day. And before you know it, you'll have a to-do list, and then you'll be much more organized. Again, it's just a matter of if you feel like you don't have time, just pick the tiniest little practice that's going to take you a few seconds. Let me throw in here. So at the back of the book is a QR code for an app that goes with the book. And you don't even need the book. You can just go to superhabits.app, superhabits.app, and you can try out the app. And basically, it helps you find what's the one virtue I could be working on right now. And uses AI, so it texts you back and it reminds you, hey, don't forget this morning you're going to the gym or whatever. But you can also argue with it and go, that's too much work. Give me something easier, and it will give you something easier. You can't get up at 3, get up at 4. So it's remarkably effective at that. But the trick is, as they always come back to, pick the smallest thing that you know you can do reliably, and then make it a habit, and then add one more thing.
Absolutely. Joe Rossinello, we have about 4 minutes left. Where do you want to go with Dr. Abela towards the end
I
here?
just want, because he's a marketing guy, and I want to pick his brain a little bit, using the focus on the word virtue, because it's a dirty word nowadays. You mention virtue to somebody, they think you're a holy roller. They think, but to be a virtuous person is to be a good person. And you mentioned, in terms of selling it to people, that it'll make you healthier, it'll make you happier. Those are, I think, things that will resonate, but it still has that negative connotation in a word that is devoid of any type of spirituality related to the one true God. I mean, people make up spiritualities, but at the end of the day, virtue comes from God. It comes from a moral being that drives and guides. How do you sell that? Because to be honest with you, in a secular context, if I was to mention to be a virtuous person, first of all, people have a million ideas of what's virtuous. They could tell you that there's 6 genders, and that's virtuous. They could tell you abortion is virtuous. They could tell you that same-sex marriage is virtuous. How do you sell true virtue in this world?
It is a big problem. As you say, you say the word virtue to someone, and they either think you're a holy roller, or they think virtue signaling, and if you're a phony, So it is a word with baggage, as you said, which is why originally the title of my book was going to be Virtue and Owner's Guide, which I thought was a kind of clever title. But I heard from people, it's like, well, that company. So super habit is a virtue. But it's a word that seems to be more appealing to people. And I think it's a sort of both and. We have to simultaneously promote the idea of super habits and tell people, look, you need to grow in these super habits. You're going to make it. So that become holy.
Thing is, too, I think most people, I mean, some people are just cuckoo that they want exactly what you're writing about in your book, Dr. Abela. The book is Super Habits, The Universal System for a Successful Life. The author, Dr. Andrew Abela, was gracious enough to join us here for the last hour. Doc, we have a minute. tell our audience where they could find out more about you, whether you have social media, where they.
So if you search Dean Abela or Andrew Abela on LinkedIn, buy and connect every day on Super Habits. I'm also on Substack, superhabit.substack.com, Superhabit in singular in this case, more kind of longer pieces. And then the book itself, institute.com, wherever good books are sold.
Awesome. And you could also click the link in the description account for buying the book using that link because Joe and Joe. Dr. Andrew Abela, this has been a great conversation. We're so great. Agree. Let's just say you're anytime. We'd love to pick your brain more, maybe talk about some other topics, particularly in this regard. We'd love to have you. I would love to talk to you about Catholic social teaching too, maybe in another conversation if you'd be up for it. But we'd talk to you about anything. This has been great, and we're so grateful that you decided to come on.
My pleasure. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, and thank you all out there for joining us here at the Veritas Catholic Radio Network, 1350 on your AM dial, sing the truth of the Catholic faith to the New York City metropolitan area. Download the app, share it with your friends. You'll have access to all of our station's content. And if you like what Joe and I do, we're all over social media, X, Rumble, Facebook, YouTube. We go live Thursday nights where we get in a whole lot of trouble. So help us out liking, subscribing, and sharing so we can get out to a wider audience. Thanks once again. And remember, until the next time, that our conversation is your conversation, and that conversation is going on everywhere. We'll talk to you soon.